to the weekly Endgame lecture here at the St. Louis Chess Club. And today my theme, what we're talking about, is how people are not pawns. And it sounds funny, it is kind of funny, but there's some deeper chess truths to it, and so I'm going to try to get into that today. The game we're looking at today is Smyslov against Walter Browne, America's one and only, from 1970. And I'll maybe even talk a little bit about this tournament that they're playing in as we get into it. Now, this is an endgame lecture, so I'm just going to cruise through the opening moves here. And this is a system that Smyslov used against King's Indian setups often. And it looks pretty tame, but actually there's a bit of venom in it. And so black can do many different things. Browne plays a d6. This is probably still fine. And we get this position here, where I still think, well, let's call it theory or whatever you want to say. Black hasn't made any controversial moves. Knight c3, and then Browne's first really strange move in the game, which honestly I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why he did it. I've spent a lot of energy trying to figure out why Browne made this ugly looking move. He played queen c8, and it's really an abysmal move. I guess, stressing the guess part, that his intention is to trade off the bishop on g2 here. However, even if he were to achieve this, it's not that easy, or it's not that great of a deal. So, for example, even if Smyslov had played e4, bishop h3, let's say rook e1, we still have a beautiful Maroczy bind position for white. In any case, I assume that was his intention, and before I leave this, I just want to make a quick note. I promised myself I wasn't going to do this, but I got to, because it's just such an interesting thing, a plan that black can play in these positions. Whether white plays b3 or bishop g2, well, let's use it with the b3. b3, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g7. And now, if you want to do this weird queen c8 idea, this is a tangent, by the way. I just want to point out, well, maybe it's not so much of a tangent. Let's just talk about this for a second. So this can go like this. Could have castled first. It's going to be the same deal. In a position like this, what's very interesting is that now queen c8 is not so dumb. And this is actually, there's so many ways you can talk about how pawns aren't people, but let's get into it, right? Okay, so the first way in which most people understand that pawns aren't people is that you should be willing to sacrifice them to get your pieces moving. And so that's just the fundamental block that every chess player has to get around, a psychological block. And that's very important. And that's definitely part of the message of pawns aren't people. But what I'm talking about here is this other deeper thing where all of us have certain notions about what you do in certain pawn structures. And I think it's very debilitating, this notion of pawn structures being equated with plans. And I think my chess was largely ruined when I was a kid, because I went into the local library. Back then, there were these things called books that you would read about chess. And one, for example, was, I remember Hans Kmock's book about pawn structures. It was just pages and pages. And it felt like very deep and philosophical. So my young mind was very drawn to this thing. But it was all about, what you do in certain pawn structures, what you're fighting for, and yada, yada. And let me just use this position as an example. In the other position, queen c8 didn't make much sense. But now queen c8 has a lot more bite, and there's a very key difference that has not anything to do with pawn structure and everything just to do with piece placement. And that is that now black has the option of playing h5, h4. And it looks barbaric, this thing. But there's two things to notice. One, the rook is on h8. And two, is also very important, the king is actually defending this e7 square, which would be the natural way for white to create some drama with knight c3, d5. Because the standard saying goes that when an attack on the wing is met by an attack in the center. But here, the king is remarkably stable, even though it doesn't look right. Okay, so what do I want to say with this example? It's not the pawn structure, it's the pieces. Forget the pawns. The pawns are the setting of what's going on, and they should be sacrificed for the activity of the pieces. And I don't just mean sacrificed in the sense of giving them away, but I mean sacrificed in the sense of maybe creating a weakness, right? Having some struggle with the pawns. Okay, let's go back to the game. In this position, queen c8 makes no sense. To me, anyways. Like I said, I fought long and hard trying to understand it. All right, rook c1. And now black gives up on the plan of knight takes d4. And I assume that the reason was something he was worried about. Bishop h3, knight d5. So we're threatening knight c6, knight e7. Like I said, the e7 point comes under fire. And of course, if knight d5, cd is a disaster. But even here, he could have, I guess, played this position with this miracle move. And we get this mess where white is definitely better, but black could conceivably play this position. All right, so rook c1, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop c6. All right, here's the first big moment for thinking about the presuppositions of both players here. Now, let's say some obvious things. White is ahead in development, and white has more space. And this second thing of having more space is what's going to encourage black to play bishop c6 to try to trade some stuff off. Now, in this regard, we can say firmly that queen c8 was a full loss of a tempo. Okay? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's lost, but it means that he's going to suffer. I think the idea of rook c1 shut down his idea of bishop h3. But note that black's structure is still fundamentally sound. We could call this a dragon structure, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this dragon structure. But this is a real interesting position for us to think about here. I think that what I would certainly do here, and I think most players would do, and let me show, is knight d5. We're threatening knight takes e7, and the variation could go something like this. Bishop takes, and c takes is possible, but I like this better because I like that beautiful bishop. And of course, you can't take the bishop because this is mate over here on g7. So knight h5, we can get a variation like this. And the thing that's very interesting about this position and is going to be a factor for us in this game is that Smyslov is of a much older chess school than we are now today. Today, after Fischer, shortly after this, kind of proves the idea of the Fischer endgame, which is rook and bishop destroys rook and knight. And that's definitely something we can talk about in a different endgame lecture. But in that demolition, especially with the Taimanov match, people then started to say, oh, the bishop is stronger than the knight. And I would definitely say the bishop's stronger than the knight in this position. Smyslov, however, is of this older school which really wants to say that the knight and the bishop are really fundamentally equal. Now, that doesn't mean that there are some positions that the bishop thrives in and some positions that the knight thrives in. But fundamentally, they're equal beasts. They just do different things. So one of the interesting things about this position, and imagining Smyslov maybe going into it, is that for him the advantage wouldn't be as apparent as I think most GMs now would say white is clearly better in this position. Okay, and to understand that prejudice is important because it helps us understand this move, which takes, I think, a lot of tactical ingenuity just to think of it. And basically, Smyslov is going to play to kill this bishop, and he plays e4. Now, the reason that this move, this is really a star move. I don't even know if it's better than knight d5, but it's a star move just because it shows tactical creativity. Most people wouldn't even think about it because you're worried about knight takes e4. And it's like, oh man, I just blundered something serious. And so what did he see? He saw this trick, knight d5, check, and then wherever you go, this thing's going to go with check. And so we'll take this thing and we'll have the two bishops plus a weak pawn with a clear advantage. So what's interesting about this e4 move is not only is it a good move, but it's going to set the stage for what Smyslov thinks the pawn structure battle now should be. And in terms of pieces, what he's saying is he wants to work against this piece. He's going to try to make this piece poor. And it's, for the most part, a great strategy. But we're going to see he's so committed to it that it's going to be, he's going to miss some key opportunities. And we're going to see black has some pawn structure ideas as well that's going to make him miss some basic opportunities. And so I'm going to say this maybe twice just because it's such an interesting thing, but I'm going to put in a personal context. You know, one of the things about just the way, I don't know, my chess is, or what I believe in chess, is that I really believe in going over your own games. And one very interesting thing for me is just recently, I was analyzing a game that I lost. And in analyzing it, I found I had a lot of presuppositions about the pawn structure. Now, so it's a funny thing. You can shout in a philosophical manner, as I'm now doing in this lecture, that you should believe that pawns aren't people and that you should not allow the preconceptions of the pawn structure to guide you. But it's funny, maybe it's especially for a guy like me who grew up in an older generation who read that Kamok book, and there was this Andy Soltis book, I think it was called Pawn Power in Chess or something like that. And they ruin you because they disturb your sense of what the pieces are about, and the pieces are more important. All right, so e4, huge ingenuity just to shut that bishop on c6 down. Queen d7. Now, this is part of a plan that Browne has to play queen d7, but I'm going to say, even though it doesn't change the nature of the position too much, what I don't like about it is that it removes the possibility of knight d7. And so, one of the key things about a space advantage in general is, like here, you will often have squares that more than one of your pieces wants to move through, right? Like here, the queen is in the way of the knight. Hence, trading some stuff is in black's interest. Notice also that it is true what Smyslov is working with. He's jamming this bishop, right? He's saying it can do absolutely nothing, and it's kind of in the way of all the black pieces. And that's fundamental to see both the good parts of his coming moves and a couple of his mistakes. So, queen d2, rook fc8, rook fe1, and now a6. This is all pretty standard stuff, especially from a guy like Browne who plays the Sicilian, and he's going to dream of a b5 break. And although I don't think a6 necessarily ruins it for him, after a4, things are pretty difficult because it is very difficult to actually ever play b5 in a meaningful way. So I think, for example, b5, I think I take it, and you can't do that because of e5. And if you go back, I think there's this trick here, e5. And then I'm winning a piece. So this is going to be a little bit of a problem long term, where black is going to shut the queen side down. Rook a b8. And now here's our first interesting moment that I want to share with you. I hope it's not the first, actually. But it's one of the interesting moments about the question. The first, let's call it this, the first interesting moment with the question of knight d5. Okay, so what I think was going on here is Smyslov does not want to play knight d5 for a couple reasons. The first and most important is he doesn't want to trade the bishop on c6. And we're going to look at a couple of these. But the knight d5, honestly, it seems to me to really always lead to a very pleasant position. For example, bishop takes, pawn takes, we're freeing the e-rook. And b5 doesn't work at all because of something like this. And notice, I'm going to hammer the rook down on c6 very soon. I think this position is actually lost. And if instead you don't play b5 and do something like this, I'm probably going to just gang up on the e-pawn. And again, have a very centralized and beautiful position. Now, that said, I don't think knight a2, which was played in the game, is a mistake. Again, Smyslov is going to use tactics to make b5 uncomfortable. Maybe I'll show that first. b5, knight b4. cb and a5 was also good, but this is nice because we are going to, on this move, we can take and play e5, and it's a wreck. So that's not possible, and what we're doing is a very small improvement of the position. Now, in last week's lecture, I talked about the difference between arsonists and builders. Arsonists being players who want to play for the initiative right away and are very dynamic. And this is a great example of a player who is a builder. And one thing that I'll say about Smyslov and myself that's interesting is, at a certain point, I came to really study Smyslov, and there's a book he published called Endgame Virtuoso, which really has loads of his endgames, from start to finish, and this game is in there. And I realized while reading that Smyslov was a guy whose principles I felt like I understood. And so I could, more than any other world champion after studying him, I felt like I could predict his moves, and I feel like I could understand the rationale behind most of them. Now, that doesn't say that I was as good as him or anything like that. For example, that e4 move earlier, I'm sure that wouldn't have even crossed my mind. But just that I have a sense for his principles. And that is something I think is, I can recommend really to anybody, the idea that you should find somebody whose game you understand and try to get a sense of what their chess principles are. And definitely here we're talking about somebody who's a builder, not an arsonist. Okay, queen d8, and this was all part of his plan when Browne did this, right? He played queen d7, he wants to move the rooks over, the queen goes back, maybe now knight d7. And here we go, knight b4. So we're just going to look at the bishop, and it's this funny staring contest where, first of all, we've opened up our bishop on b2, and that's important. But also, it's going to be difficult for black to ever do things like b5, and at some moment, of course, knight takes c6 could become unpleasant. The intention, however, is if the bishop ever moves, then we'll think about playing knight d5. Okay, knight d7, bishop takes, king takes. And let's pause for a second in this position. One thing I've noticed is that there are many players out there who never want to play against a Maroczy bind because it just feels so terrifying. And this is one of those positions. A guy who I think has been GM in residence here, Eugene Perelstein, regularly gets positions, not as bad as this, but he plays a lot of positions that are similar. And let's just talk a little bit about this position and the pawn structure and what's going on. First, the black king is a little bit weaker. And if anything, he probably owes us a tempo. And that's going to be big going forward. Second, this is a thing that all Sicilian dragon positions have in common. And that is that in the Sicilian, you get an extra center pawn, right? So for example, that's our extra center pawn. But the weird thing about the dragon is that it's often simply not doing a big central fight. And this is going to be critical for what goes on next. Because what I want you guys to see is, even though we're dealing with two very strong GMs, both players miss at several points the idea for black to play e6. And it's going to be important in a number of regards. The biggest one is we're just stopping knight d5. Now, what's the prejudice against e6? Well, you're worried about the d6 pawn, right? So there's some reptilian part of the chess playing brain that's going to come up both for Smyslov and Browne, where neither of them can even see the move e6 because they're terrified of this pawn being weak. And this is one of the fundamental prejudices that I want to really get into for thinking about how pawns aren't people. All right, black has several moves here. Bishop h3 might be interesting, but since we're going to get a similar position, I'm going to talk about the bishop h3 idea in a second. So, rook e3, queen a5, check to the king, and black says, I would love to have this queen exchange. Okay, Smyslov is going to say, yes, I think this queen exchange is a great idea. And maybe he shouldn't. Maybe he shouldn't because the black king is a little bit more open. But this is his intention. And let's look at how he does it. Bishop h3. So, actually, of all moves so far, I think this is the only one of Smyslov's so far that I can call like a clear mistake. Everything else, you know, up to move 22 here, seems to be absolutely perfect. And it's all about, this mistake is all about pawn structure, and Browne doesn't see the problem with this move. So let's take a look. What Browne could have done here is taken, and you can take both ways with the rook or the pawn. Let's say we take this way and now play e6. And let's say a couple things. All of a sudden, black's position isn't that bad. This bishop now owes white a tempo because it's hitting absolutely nothing now. There's no more knight d5. And the only thing black has to worry about is the d6 pawn. However, you know, in this position, if you play, say, f3, I'm well in time to defend d6, let's say knight c5. And or I could have even played king f8 first, and then king e7 is going to come. So this position, I think, is already better for black. It's a real interesting turnaround because now the pieces are free and the knight on b4 isn't looking so hot. And in fact, there's some beautiful endgames that Eugene Perelstein has played in this Maroczy where, you know, he trades these guys off and actually plays knight versus bishop. And one of the things that he proves actually in these kinds of positions is what Smyslov says in the book, which is if you get a position with a blockading nature, the knight will be better than the bishop. And this is definitely a position where the knight could conceivably be better than the bishop. especially if it, gets some nice blockade squares. And we're going to see that in a second. So now, this was a bad idea, bishop h3, because the e6 move is so strong. However, it is in fact a very rich, there's some rich ideas behind it. Let's look. Rook c7, queen takes, f4, knight d7, and now a5. Really putting the squeeze on. And one thing that I want us to notice is that at any point, white can play bishop takes d7 and play the knight against the bishop. And this is one of the things I know Smyslov is now looking for, and he's looking to do it on his terms. So knight c5 I thought was probably the best. It definitely feels like the most logical, and it will help us understand what comes here if we understand knight c5. So the thing about knight c5 though is I think my boy needs to now play knight d5. Takes. We got a pin, but this position is really terrible for black. I would say lost, because that poor a6 pawn is flailing in the wind. And it helps, this variation helps illustrate some of the ideas that are lurking behind the a5 move. Ben, do we got any comments from the stratosphere?
Nothing too relevant to mention.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to go through that variation is this move, rook c3, looked really weird to me, and I also kind of had to scratch my head to see what it was all about. I wanted him, both on this move and the move before, to take. That was just my intuition about what he should do. And I think I'm going to call that a clear advantage. I think it's very unpleasant for black. But this move, the funny thing is, if it were true that e6 was not possible, then rook c3 wouldn't ruin anything. But of course, e6 is possible. And the bummer for both players, they didn't see it. It was possible in so many moves that it's clear that neither one of them saw the possibility of e6 because of the prejudice against the d6 pawn. But you can see once the king comes here, that pawn is going to be amply defended, and it really wrecks both of white's minors. And that goes to the heart of what I'm trying to say when I say pawns aren't people. The pawns are there to restrict your opponent's pieces and make your pieces better. They're just the tapestry of the position. And so it's very critical that we get over conceptually the notions that hold us down with the pawn structure, like this, where both simply thought it wasn't a possibility. Now, rook c3. Besides missing e6, I think the intention was a dirty trick where on knight c5 now, snip, snip, takes, and now we're actually losing a full piece because b4 is always going to happen, and there's no way to get another rook over here because the bishop, let's say b6. And now, let's look. The rook defends this guy instead of him being on c1, so now we can just take the knight. So, it's interesting because in the other variation, right, the knight d5 was pretty well crushing after knight c5, but he doesn't want to do it, right? So he's setting up rook c3, so it will be absolutely crushing if black plays knight c5. And that gives a good sense, too, of where Smyslov is coming from in this endgame. Namely, he really is trying to squeeze Browne completely out. Now, e6 should be played. King e8. A strange move because he's setting himself up for this kind of stuff. Now, bishop g2 bishop takes d7 is very strong. Bishop g2 was played. In this position, it might be a little late now to play e6, because now there's a kind of famous trick where we can do things like e5, snip, and then, there's the knight a6 problem. So at least, now I don't think either of them saw it, because neither of them were looking at e6, but because black has put his king on a funny square there, it's a little bit more difficult for him to get away with that. So Browne plays king f8. Now, I played Browne many times. Browne passed away a couple years ago of a stroke, and the guy was really intense to play against, and was so much energy on the board, so much energy that he always got in time pressure. Back then, no increment. And what you can feel from several of Browne's next moves is that he was in serious time pressure. Moves like king e8, king f8. All right, here we go. King f2, a building move. e5. Now, this is an interesting point to talk about pawn structure. A metaphor that makes a lot of sense to me is to say that, in life, some of us are able to thrive in certain situations and not in other situations, right? So, for example, the slightly autistic computer kids and the chess kids are now thriving in America's internet economy. But 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they wouldn't have done so well. It's not so easy. And the same way with pawn structures. A good rule that I like, actually, is anytime someone changes the structure of the position, like e5 does, that's the moment to change up how you're thinking about the position. And so this next move, bishop h3, I think it's technically a mistake, but it's got a very deep idea, which is the following. We could have taken the knight earlier. We had several opportunities to do so. And that would have been a great position, at least I thought so. But now that e5 has been played, what e5 declares is that black is going to try to create a blockade on the dark squares, right? And also, he is going to shut down the advance of the e-pawn. So this pawn here is now just a duck. Let's call it a blockaded duck. And so the deep idea of bishop h3 is that white is saying, now is the time that I would like to steal that knight. And in a funny thing, I'm sure Browne was in time pressure, but it's an interesting thing here where I feel he made his next move thinking to himself, well, Smyslov didn't take it before, now he's not going to take it. They're really interesting. So instead, he should move he just don't allow the trade for sure. He's still a little bit worse after moves like knight f6 or knight c5, but for sure it's incredibly dangerous now to allow this exchange, and that's what happens. Okay, bishop takes is not possible because of knight d5. So rook takes. And it's a funny position. At first sight, maybe it doesn't seem like black is in that much trouble, but he's in fact, let's say, close to lost. And it's hard to imagine. What are the factors? Well, funnily enough, even though so much has been traded, black still has less space. And one thing about less space in endgames is that your king will oftentimes be either poor, as in less active, or simply a victim. And definitely here, Black king, even though he looks safe now, he's under fire, and this rook is going to come over here, and it's going to be hard for him to find a square to land on. Now, one of the humorous things I want you guys to see about this position is we here too are going to have multiple opportunities for white to play knight d5, but he's not going to do it. He's not going to do it for a long time, and that is again all these prejudices in the position about like how you play against black. So here we go: rook e2, f6, king e3, rook f8, and now definitely a mistake. Here was, I think, a really important moment where white needed to recognize the danger of black creating counterplay. And I'm sure this was time pressure for both players, but still, it's really important to see that the crime that Browne commits in the following 10-15 moves on repeated occasions is going to be, he thinks that this is a pawn structure where he can just sit and be passive with his pieces. And that to me is the cardinal crime of endgame play, maybe play in general. But also, especially, it's a crime that happens when we're either addicted to saving our pawns or addicted to holding a certain structure or addicted to not having any weak pawns, right? That's when we do these kinds of weird things and make our pieces passive. Okay, so rook d2 is a natural move, but one where black can now get activity with f5, and it just makes a lot of sense. He wants to open this guy up, he wants to open this guy up, and the best I could do here was knight d5, but of course, I obviously didn't want to play this. A nice endgame actually is to think of. I think king e6 is probably the best try here, but bishop d5, snip, and it seems at first like maybe it's not so dangerous, but consider that this is a threat, and then these two pawns are going to be very powerful with the rooks behind him. And if e4, b4, and then we put the king on d4, and we really have one of these building positions where at our leisure we're going to play c5 when we're ready for it. Okay, so let's go back, rook d2, and here's a really sad move. I think of all the moves that Browne plays in this game, this is the one I'm most upset with, and that's rook fd8. Why? Because it's so passive and ugly. I'm sure I can still see the guy. I played him so many times. He'd be sitting there making all kinds of noises and gestures and stuff and freaking out, and then he'd play rook fd8. Okay, so let's look at how it goes. Rook d3, king e6, and now it's really interesting thing happens here where my sensei, is just unable to play knight d5. Let's put it on the board here for a second. So knight d5, and it's really annoying if you don't take it, because there's all kinds of stuff like knight b6, as well as strengthening moves like b4, and you got to watch out for strikes like f5. So let's say you take the thing. Takes. King e7. Takes. Well, now you can't take with a d-pawn, because then if you take with a d-pawn, we're going to have to say that's lost. And now bear in mind, it's not necessarily lost simply because the pawns are beautiful. It's lost because these poor rooks are up against the wall of those pawns. The pawns are making the rooks poor. That's why it's so terrible. So imagine f takes, rook f2, and I just said to myself, well, black's got to try that if he wants to live. Snip, snip, king e4. He's got to try that if he wants to live. And rook f3 is a real power move. Yeah, very nice pawn endgame, because it's not that complicated, but it's kind of beautiful, where we're just going to go back, and when we're ready, we're going to do that, and that's pretty well it, because the guy can't move once we get there. Yeah, really nice. So, in this position, my sensei does something controversial and plays g4. And right away, Browne takes. Let's say that that's correct. And I think when Browne played e5, something like this was his original intuition, which is two things. Like a Najdorf player that he wanted to access the e5 square eventually, right? Like now. Though obviously it's kind of hard to get there at the exact moment. But also that ultimately the bishop wants to at least dream of an open position. And so we're getting a little bit of openness now. Browne continues to play passively here, but I think here was his big chance. G5, King E3, and Rook H8, and it's a great example. We don't care about the pawn weaknesses. We want the activity. Once the activity comes, oh man, white better watch out, right? I'm not saying white is worse here, but all of a sudden white has to really start paying attention. Yeah, so, and G5, what, it kind of feels like a weakness? Doesn't feel like, yeah, it feels fine to me. Also, ideally, I want to put my pawns on dark squares. All right, so Rook C8. Here they bounce around a little bit, clearly some time pressure. And now, move 39, King E3, King D4, Rook F8. So, both players now get some time to think about the situation. And this position, let's say, is incredible for white, and with the couple moves that black gave white, was enabled to build his position greatly here by improving the situation of his king. One reason I think endgames are so great to study, and by endgames I don't really mean like the Dvoretsky manual where you're learning about algorithms, how to shut something, you know, how to play a certain configuration, how to do some specific mate. But rather these kinds of endgames where mistakes on both sides are going to be made, but where you learn to improve your pieces and think more deeply about what a good piece and a bad piece means. And the reason I think it's more interesting than in the middle game is in the end game, you've only got 4 guys. Now notice I said only 4. Forget the pawns. They're not people. You got 4 guys, right? And if one of them's bad, that's a ratio of 1 in 4 of your force that's now going to be weak. In the middle game, a lot of times, let's say you got 8 guys. If you have that one weak piece, a lot of players, even 2,200 players, they don't feel it. They don't feel it as part of like their body that something that has gone wrong. So when you play end games or study them, like this game here, you start getting a sense of really thinking deeply about how these pieces, how their activity looks and how they're working together. All right, that's my pitch for the endgame. Rook F2. Obviously, black is passive, and he has to worry about G5 at some point. Also very difficult for the king to move. Now, one humorous thing about this position is that it's getting difficult for black to not move the bishop. So black played bishop d7, and finally, as if on cue, Smyslov is carrying through this this plan that he started with, I don't know, whenever he played e4 on move, what do we got here? Move 13, right? That's a plan he started on a move 13, which is we're going to stare at the bishop until he gives me the d5 square. And then he finally moves in. It's funny. I did the commentary here at the club for the junior championship, and Darwin Yang said this hilarious thing about one of the senior games that was going on. Senior championship was going on at the same time. And he said, it looks like they're playing chess from the 90s. And we just thought that was hilarious. And what he was saying, wasn't just funny, but had a point, which is that back in the day, before the computers, people played with plans. And you can see this as a plan in action. It's just kind of a guideline for how he wanted the game to go. And he's definitely it's happened now. Thanks mostly to black being passive. The thing to say actually about the plan comment, the chess in the 90s comment, that applies to our theme today, which is pawns aren't people, is that the plan is only there to make your pieces better or your opponent's pieces worse. It's not there to do a pawn structure thing, whatever pawn structure. For example, one thing that ruined me was in that Soltis book. He talks actually about this knight move, and he calls it the Marco hop. I'd never even heard that term before or since, the Marco hop. And he talks at length about this thing. And it didn't help me because I just wanted my pieces to be good. And instead I had all kinds of visions of pawn structures and what I was supposed to do in those pawn structures. All right, bishop c6, are we going to trade it? Nope, we're going to hide over there. Rook h8. And now this interesting moment where after rook h8, now knight d5. And what I want to really give you a sense of is that Smyslov is a man who really, I guess you could say, came to his senses and realized that knight d5 was in fact really a brutal move to face. And the first thing just to see about it is when we take this way now, the king has to go to e7, we play rook e3, and now b4, and the game's actually over because c5 is going to come and we will land on some kind of square like rook e6. So he finally sees it, and this is like, I don't know, the fifth or sixth time he had an opportunity to effectively land on d5, and he does finally do it. Hf8, b4, and now, honestly, the game's pretty easy. Bishop d7, h4, white had other moves as well, h5, snip, c takes now. One of the great things about knight d5 was there was so many positions where we had both ed and cd, and sometimes there were positions even with the rook takes that were strong. King d7, and here's a real nice cold-blooded move here, h6. That's really an old school move, and that is the move that he had intended with h4, h5. It's a great game, actually, in the senior championship. I got in trouble because Ben Simon here was talking at me, and other people were like, Jesse, you got to get off. There's other exciting games going on. You got to get Yermo off of there. He's talking too long. And I was like, no, we're going to talk about this. And one of the great things that Yermo did, similar press, and before he undertook any decisive action, stuck that H-pawn deep in there, and it really made life a lot harder. And so let's see how this H-pawn finishes it off here. Rook over, g5, rook over. Simple chess. Now we'll bring the king in. And the point is, there's no saving the H-pawn anymore because I always have rook g8 check, right? So rook d5, check. And of course, king g8, I can play rook c7, king h8, rook takes b7. And here's a simple truth about rook endgames, that connected passed pawns, they're absolutely evil. So in this position, Browne saw h7 coming, and he resigned. So one thing I want to stress about a lot of these things I say here, is it's one thing to be a chess philosopher and have like notions like pawns aren't people. And something I just want to stress from my own personal experience of analyzing my games is the pawn structure things, your presuppositions of how you're supposed to play in certain pawn structures, they'll always be there. And I think, you'll never totally get rid of them, but you can kind of work to overcome them in the sense of just being aware of them, right? Kind of maybe like our prejudices in daily life, right? They're always going to be there, and then we just have to be aware of when they're actually working for us and when they're not. All right, thank you so much, and we'll leave it there.